Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video as we study together. This is a series called Game Changers, and there are a lot of times in the Bible when God steps into a situation and makes a huge change. I would like to ask, what would you say if you could talk to someone who had ruined your life? Every now and then, after a big court case, we get to see people interact. One is a relative of a victim. The other is a person who has created some tragedy for this family. They've perpetrated a crime. Maybe they've murdered the person. Maybe they have assaulted them in some way. But it has created a lot of turmoil for that family. And when you get to watch these people interact with one another, it's so interesting to see what their demeanor is towards one another, especially what the victim's family would have to say to the person who caused so much harm and trouble and pain to their family. What would you say, though? If you could talk to someone who had ruined your life, who had caused you untold heartache and trouble, what would your attitude be? In the book of Genesis, we get to meet a man named Joseph. And Joseph has a lot of older brothers. I don't know if you have older brothers, but I'm the oldest, so I can speak from experience. Sometimes we can be a little brutal to our younger siblings. And to say that Joseph's older brothers were brutal towards him would be a grave understatement. They went so far as to fake their own brother's death. They had great problem with him. He was the favorite child of their father. His father did things for Joseph that he wouldn't do for the rest of the boys. The Bible says that he gave him a coat of many colors. This was an expensive piece of clothing. And surely this reminded them every time they saw him wear it, that's Daddy's favorite. And so they devised this plan together that they are going to kill him. But one of the brothers steps in. He says, why would we kill him when instead we could profit? So they throw him into a ditch, wait for people to come along, and they ultimately sell him into slavery. Imagine what this would be like, how this would change your life. And as we read the way that Joseph's life pans out, it seems like it's one bad thing happening after another, until ultimately he comes to a place of great position. As the famine comes through the land of Egypt, he is made number 2 in the land under Pharaoh himself. And as he works in Egypt, he plans and he makes decisions that are going to not only save the land of Egypt in this famine, but ultimately he is able to provide for his family at home, who he's been separated for all these years from. We think about the great impact that he has on not only his family, but on the world as they know it because of his wise decisions. You see, one of the things we learn from this story is that God is with Joseph. God is with him throughout all of these terrible things that happen, and God is working a plan. But ultimately, as we see Joseph interacting with his brothers later in life, while he's in command and in charge in the land of Egypt, they have come to get food so that their family doesn't starve to death during this famine. He recognizes them, and eventually he is able to have candid conversations with his brothers. And as we see all this happen, it's very interesting and maybe very unexpected how he handles his brothers and meeting them again. Let's read begin in Genesis 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord to all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. I don't know about you, but those words are shocking. He begins to weep and he reveals his identity to his brothers, and they are dismayed. I think they are terribly afraid because they realize that now he is in power. He's no longer that little snot-nosed kid that they sold into slavery to try and get him out of their life. Now they're looking at a man who possesses all of the power of Egypt, only second to Pharaoh himself. I think they're scared, and I think they're intimidated. But what is the message that Joseph gives to them? Don't be afraid. Don't be fearful, because it's not so much what you did to me, but it is how God has worked through my life to bring me to this moment so that my family could be saved. I don't know about you, but that's far more mature than I could have been in that situation. It's amazing to hear him talk to his brothers, the ones who had sold him out, the ones who had ruined his life, who had kicked off a series of unfortunate events for him. And yet he says, don't be afraid. I'm not holding this against you, because this is something that God has ordained. It's something that God has brought about so that God's plan for our family living on could be continued. In the coming verses, Joseph is going to make sure that he gets to see his father again. In fact, this has been one of his concerns through this entire passage. Talk to me about Dad. Is Dad still alive? I want to meet Dad. I want to be reunited with all of my family, but especially my father. This is someone he has not seen for now probably the majority of his life. But I wonder, what are things going to look like when Jacob is not around anymore? Whenever his father is now out of the picture, how is he going to respond to his brothers? I think that it's easy in a lot of families for families to hold tight, to act respectfully to one another, as long as the parents are alive. But it seems like in many situations, once a parent or both parents pass away, a lot of children become almost against one another. They want to sort things out legally when it comes to the estate of their parents to make sure everyone gets the share that they are legally entitled to. In a lot of ways, the death of a parent can be very decisive among the children. And that's unfortunate. But I think that's what Joseph's brothers are going to be worried about. Let's skip over to the end of the book of Genesis. And here Jacob has passed away. But notice the way that Joseph still talks to his brothers. This is Genesis 50, verse 15 and following. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "May it be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. You know, as you read this, you think about the way that the brothers get ahead of Jacob dying and telling Joseph about this from the very get-go. They immediately send word to Joseph that this is something our father commanded for us to tell you. This is Dad's dying wish, that you forgive your brothers, that you let go of it, that you make peace with them. And as I read this, I wonder, is this even something that Jacob ever said, or is this something that the brothers have put together to in some way try and save themselves? They still realize that Joseph has a great power over them, that he's got power to really do anything he wants. And probably politically, nobody would have batted an eye had he just really made an example out of his brothers. So they send this delegation saying, our dad, his dying wish was that you forgive us. But there are a few things I want you to note here that are very interesting about the way that Joseph handles this entire thing. And part of it, I think, is because of his maturity, but a lot of it is about his spiritual reckoning with what has happened in his life. And this is what's going to be valuable for me and you as we move on in our lives. You see, aligning with the heart of God and the plans of God, realizing that there are things that happen in our life that are not fair, they're not right, they're out of our control, but God can do good through them. That is one of the things that will bless you and me so much in our lives. Realizing that God works in mysterious ways sometimes. There are sometimes things that we can't explain. We don't want to be able to know how these things are going to be good. But then God works through even the hardest things in our lives, and He makes good things happen through them. You'll notice the difference here in the way that the brothers handle things and the way that Joseph handles things. Immediately we see that they are assuming hate and retribution from their brother. And Joseph, on the other hand, he assumes that there's going to be peace with them. They assume that Joseph hates us. Joseph is going to try and get back at us. But Joseph says, I've already told you, there's no hard feelings because God is taking care of this. God has been with me. God has blessed me through these years of my life, even though there was trouble and there was heartache and there were so many unfair things that happened to me. God has used those things for good. The second thing we'll notice is that the brothers are, in a sense, stuck in the past. Their minds continually go back to what they have done to Joseph. And I think that part of this is guilt, but I think it's also because in their mentality, they can't get past that thing they did to their brother. So their assumption is that their brother can't get past it either. The interesting thing, though, is that Joseph's mind seems to be freed from the past. He says, hey, what happened all those years ago when you sold me into slavery? That happened to me, but it's not who I am. That has not conquered my life. And in a big sense, when we realize that God can work through even the hardest or worst parts of our life for good, it frees us from being all about one thing. It doesn't make us a victim of circumstance, but rather we're able to conquer our past with the ability from God. God helps us to move past even the darkest parts of our past so that ultimately we can work for His glory in the present and in the future. Third thing we notice is that their brothers are scared of judgment. And what is it that Joseph says to them? Do not fear. And I think it's interesting that he uses this phrase, do not fear, with them twice in Genesis 50. Don't worry about this. Don't fear. But what is the reasoning that he gives here? For am I in the place of God? God gets to judge things, but we don't. And Joseph says it would be wrong for me to pay retribution to you because I'm not God. And I think this is a huge spiritual indication of where he is, because he is not going to sit in the seat of God. He is not going to hold over someone else something from their past. Just as God forgives us and allows us to move past our past, God's people ought to do the same. We ought to forgive others and let them move on beyond their past. A fourth thing that we'll notice here is that Joseph's brothers continually dwell on their actions. This is what we did to you all those years ago. But what is Joseph's take on this? He says, God has worked through this. In fact, he says, it's not that you sent me to Egypt, but God worked through all these things to put me in the position that he wanted so that our family could be taken care of. Now, I don't think that Joseph here is saying, well, God made you sell me into slavery. I don't think that's the way God works, nor do I think that's what happened in this situation. God didn't whisper into their ear, I want you to sell your brother into slavery. I want you to treat him terribly. That's not who God is, and it's not what God is going to do. On the other hand, I think it is fair to say that when people make decisions, God does not have his hands tied. People are able to do right things and wrong things that affect other people, but God can work through those things for his purpose, for his glory, for his means, for his plans. God's hands are never tied in any situation. He never has to step back and say, I wish I could do something with this, but I just can't. No, instead, all throughout the Bible, we see times when people do things, and yet God works through them to accomplish his will and to accomplish his purpose. Ultimately, what we learn from this is that God is so mighty that it doesn't matter what people do. God can work through it to make his purpose be accomplished. And then the last thing we see is that the brothers are just torn up about this. They are so anxious. They are so troubled about what is going to happen to them. And yet, what does it seem like Joseph's emotions are during this? For me, when I read this, I see him being very calm. They're almost biting their nails because they don't know what's coming next. They're torn up emotionally and mentally. They don't know what's happening. But when I read Joseph's response in all of this, what I hear is a clear-thinking man talking about what happened in the past and what is going to be in the future. He calmly explains, I don't want to hold any of this against you. Instead, we're brothers. I want us to be treated like brothers. I want things to be right. But also, you'll notice the way that at the end it says that he comforts his brothers. He is the youngest, and yet he takes the older brothers in his arms. And he says, it's going to be okay. I'm not holding things against you. Everything's all right. And it says that he continues to speak kindly to them. I think a couple of the main takeaways from this is, first, obviously, that God can use our worst moments for his plan. Joseph says that verbatim. He says, it's not that you meant to do good by me. He says, you meant to do all this for evil, but God has used it for good. God works in the worst things. He works in the best things. God works through all things to accomplish his holy and right plan. We see this in the story of Moses. Moses ends up murdering one of the Egyptian guards, and what is it he does? Out of fear, he flees into the land of Midian, and there he's going to become a shepherd. But I think in the 40 years that he shepherds, he learns how to lead when things are difficult. And ultimately, I think that God uses this long stretch of 4 decades to teach him how to lead the people of Israel. God can use the worst things for the best ways. The second thing we take away is that we see how God works in our lives. We give him the glory for that. We see that God works in good ways, but then it also allows us to relieve pressure and guilt from other people. What is it that Joseph does here? He says, look, I realize you didn't mean to do good by me at all, but God did good. And because God did good through this, I can't hold these things against you. He says, more than that, I'm not in the seat of God. I can't hold you accountable for these things anyway. That's what God can do. But when we see that God works in good ways, even through bad times, through stressful times, through heartbreaking times, it allows us to relieve other people's guilt and fear and stress. The third thing is that working for God's purpose gives us peace and it gives us fulfillment. Joseph talks about this over and over again, but I love that he talks about this in the last interaction he has with his brothers in Genesis 50. He says, I'm going to continue to care for your children, your little ones. I'm going to keep providing for our family. He finds fulfillment in who he is, because of all the bad things that led him to where he is. And I think that it takes a big level of human maturity, but also spiritual maturity, to look into our lives and ask, how is God going to use this tragedy, this catastrophe, this hard time? How is he going to use this to bless my life, to bless someone else's life? And I think in some way it's us choosing not to fight against the will of God. I think that Joseph could have gone in all sorts of different directions, but because he stayed true to God, he stayed faithful in who he was, and he always looked to do what was right. Because of that, God's plan was realized in his life. And even though his brothers meant it for evil, God meant it for good. As we think about what all this means for us, first, I hope that we will step back and we see how really great God is. We see that God has things together, and God works in the most mysterious ways sometimes, ways that don't make sense to us. And yet God works in great ways. He blesses us. He provides for us. He takes good care of us. And I hope that as we reflect on our own lives, that we give the glory to God that he deserves, because he really is a caretaker for us and our souls. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it's blessed you to think about the power of our God, the way that he steps into situations in our lives, and he does good, even if others mean it for evil. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I hope God blesses you in your life.